I knew from the moment my son lifted his glass that something inside me was about to break, though I couldn't yet name the feeling rising in the back of my throat. The wedding hall glowed with the soft amber of 1,000 tiny lights, and every table shimmered like a fleeting promise of joy. I had spent years imagining what it would feel like to watch my son step into a new life, to witness the happiness I had always prayed he would find. Yet, as I sat there with my carefully composed smile and my hands clasped too tightly in my lap, I felt the weight of an unexpected loneliness pressing into my ribs. He looked so tall, so sure of himself, holding that champagne flute as if he had been born ready to give a speech that would echo for the rest of our lives. I leaned in, eager and fragile, waiting for his words to wrap me in the warmth I had longed for. But instead, I watched them cut through me like a cold wind slipping under a closed door. He tapped the glass gently, a quiet chime that silenced the room, and his eyes softened as they drifted toward the front table. Not toward me, not toward the woman who had carried him, fed him, protected him, given every piece of herself even when there was almost nothing left to give. His gaze settled on someone else with a tenderness I hadn't felt from him in years, and as he began to speak, I understood why. "To the woman who raised me right," he said, and the words drifted across the room like a ribbon the color of betrayal. A soft cheer rose around us, people smiling, nodding, clapping, unaware that each sound struck me like another small stone thrown against glass already fractured. My chest tightened as I realized he wasn't talking about me. His voice carried gratitude, admiration, and an affection so deep it felt like a secret he had been guarding from me, one he now chose to unveil at the moment I had hoped to feel closest to him. I watched as his stepmother lowered her gaze, almost bashful, the corners of her lips lifting in a gentle curve that made the whole scene feel surreal. She hadn't raised him. She came into his life when he was already practically grown, when the hard years had already scalded both of us. I had been the one wiping tears from scraped knees, sitting awake through fevers, holding him after nightmares, reminding him he was worthy even when the world seemed determined to convince him otherwise. Yet in this room filled with witnesses, he offered the honor of motherhood to someone else, and I felt decades of sacrifices dissolving like sugar in water. It was as if he had taken our story and rewritten it, placing her at the center while gently erasing me with every syllable. And perhaps what hurt the most was the ease with which he did it, as though the memory of me had become too faint to reach for. In that moment, surrounded by glittering chandeliers and slow jazz humming like a distant echo, something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger at first. It was grief so quiet, so patient, it almost felt like acceptance. I had always known that love doesn't guarantee gratitude, and motherhood doesn't promise recognition. Still, no lesson had prepared me for the hollow ache spreading through my chest as my son raised his glass higher, inviting others to join him. I stared at him through the blur of my own unshed tears, trying to decipher how we had arrived at a place where I had become invisible in his celebrations. Perhaps you understand this feeling, that strange ache of being present yet painfully unseen. Tell me, from where in the world are you watching this story unfold? Your presence here matters more than you realize. But my attention snapped back to the moment when the clinking of glasses and a wave of applause filled the room. Guests leaned toward her, offering words of praise, applauding her influence, her kindness, her role in shaping the man my son had become. I could almost feel the room pivot away from me, like a tide shifting without warning. My son stepped down from the small platform where he'd spoken, embracing her with the kind of affection I had waited years to receive again. And as they held each other, I felt something tear inside me with the soft, unmistakable sound of fabric ripping under strain. My mind drifted through memories I hadn't touched in years, each one heavy with the scent of childhood shampoo, spilled cereal, tiny shoes lined up crookedly by the door, and late nights spent whispering promises I always intended to keep. I wanted to disappear into those memories, cling to them like life rafts, but the present kept pulling me back with its sharp, unrelenting edges. A part of me wondered if moments like this were inevitable, if every mother eventually faces a day when her child's gratitude bends towards someone else, someone less worn down, someone who arrived late to the story, but still managed to claim the most beautiful lines. And as I sat there, breathing slowly as if trying to survive underwater, I felt a quiet resolve forming beneath the hurt. A voice inside whispered that I needed to stay still, to not crumble, to not let my pain become a spectacle under the swirling lights of the dance floor. Instead, I would hold myself together with the same strength that had carried me through every storm of motherhood. And if this story resonates with you, if you have ever felt replaced or forgotten in the moments you believed belonged to you, then stay with me, because what unfolded next would test every fragile piece of me. Before we go on, let your heart guide you and consider subscribing, so this story can keep reaching women who know how deep these wounds can run. The night after the wedding was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that doesn't comfort, doesn't rest. It haunts. I sat on the edge of the bed in my small hotel room, the dress I'd chosen so carefully crumpled on the chair, the sequins catching the faint light like distant stars. The air still smelled faintly of roses and champagne, and for a moment I could almost hear the echo of laughter spilling from the ballroom, the rhythm of joy that had no room for my sorrow. I took off my earrings, one by one, my fingers trembling as if removing pieces of someone else's happiness. My reflection in the mirror looked like a stranger, painted lips fading, eyes rimmed in exhaustion, the curve of my shoulders slightly bent as though the weight of invisible years had finally found their place to rest. I thought of my son, of how radiant he looked beneath the string lights, how his smile had reached all the way to his eyes when he spoke of his new wife, when he toasted to the woman who raised him right. The phrase looped in my mind like a cruel refrain. Raised him right. The words tasted bitter and foreign, as though they belonged to another language I could no longer speak. I wondered if he realized what he had taken from me in that moment. Not the acknowledgement itself, but the quiet dignity of a mother's lifelong effort. I had carried him through the darkness of unpaid bills, through winters when the heat barely worked, through heartbreaks that left him hollow and lost. I had taught him to be kind, to listen before judging, to see beauty where others saw flaws. All of that, my invisible labor of love, vanished with a single toast. When dawn came, I watched the sunlight crawl slowly across the curtains, its warmth indifferent to my grief. I wanted to call him, to ask if he meant what he said, but my voice failed me before I could even imagine the words. Instead, I replayed every conversation we'd had over the years, searching for the moment our connection began to fade. Maybe it was the day he moved out for college, or the day he brought her home for the first time, her laughter like wind chimes in a house that suddenly didn't feel like mine. Maybe it started long before that, in all the little moments I told myself he would one day understand. The late night shifts, the forgotten birthdays, the empty seat at his school play because I was working overtime to pay rent. Love doesn't always look like presents. Sometimes it's the absence you endure to make life possible for someone else. But children rarely see that until it's too late. I walked to the small balcony overlooking the parking lot, the cold morning air biting my skin. Below me, couples were leaving the hotel, laughter trailing behind them like perfume. My son and his wife passed by, their hands intertwined. I froze, afraid he might look up, afraid he wouldn't. He didn't. They got into a car, the one I'd helped him pay for years ago, and drove away without noticing me standing there in silence. It wasn't the first time I had watched him leave, but it was the first time I didn't believe he would turn back. That realization carved something new and terrible inside me. A hollow place where pride and pain coexisted like reluctant companions. The days that followed blurred together. I returned home to an apartment that suddenly felt too quiet, too full of echoes. His childhood photos lined the hallway, frozen smiles of a boy who once ran into my arms without hesitation. I paused before one picture. He must have been 7, holding a stick like a sword, grinning with a missing front tooth. I remembered taking that photo after he'd told me he was going to protect me forever. "You're my favorite person, Mom," he'd said. I ran my fingers over the glass frame and whispered, "What happened to us?" The answer, of course, didn't come. It never does. The universe doesn't stop to explain the way love fades. It just lets you live through the silence it leaves behind. I tried to keep myself busy, gardening, reading, cleaning shelves that didn't need cleaning, anything to avoid sitting still long enough for the memory of that toast to return. But every time the house went quiet, it came back. That moment, that sentence, the applause, her smile, the look on his face when he said her name instead of mine. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I'd replay the sound of his voice as if analyzing the tone could reveal some hidden kindness, some trace of confusion that meant he hadn't meant to hurt me. But deep down I knew he wasn't trying to be cruel. He simply didn't see me anymore. I had become background noise in the story of his life. Familiar, comfortable, but unremarkable. One afternoon, I received a message from him. A simple text. "Mom, thank you for coming. It meant a lot." Just 10 words. 10 fragile, uneven words trying to stitch a wound far too deep. I stared at the screen for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. What could I possibly say that didn't sound like a plea? I typed, deleted, typed again. Finally, I wrote, "Of course, sweetheart. I'm proud of you." I wasn't lying. I was proud. But pride doesn't erase pain. It just teaches you how to carry it without making noise. When I hit send, I felt both relief and an ache that stretched through me like a thread pulled too tight. Later that week, I passed by a small cafe near my house, one we used to visit together when he was a boy. The same chalkboard sign stood outside, offering discounts on muffins and lattes. I went in and ordered the same hot chocolate he used to love. Extra cream, no cinnamon. As I sat by the window, I thought about how time changes the shape of love. How it doesn't disappear. It just becomes quieter. Like a song you can still hum but can't remember all the words to. Maybe that's what motherhood really is. Learning to love even after you've been forgotten. Continuing to care even when your name no longer carries weight in someone else's story. That night, I lit a candle in the kitchen and sat in the dim glow, letting the flame flicker across the photographs spread before me. His first birthday, his graduation. A Christmas morning where the tree leaned slightly because he'd tried to decorate it himself. Every image felt like a page from a book I once wrote with all my heart, but was no longer invited to read. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to hate him. Love doesn't turn into hatred that easily. It just learns to hurt quietly, without announcement. I whispered his name into the empty room, feeling it dissolve into the quiet air. Maybe you felt this too. That strange blend of pride and pain that only a mother knows. Maybe you've watched someone you love walk into a new life where your place has quietly vanished. If you have, then you understand why I can't let this story end here. There's more, much more, that came after that wedding night. And if you're still with me, if this story speaks to something deep inside you, don't let it slip away. Subscribe now, stay close. What came next was the moment everything I believed about love, loyalty, and motherhood was turned inside out. Forever. The weeks turned into months, and the ache didn't soften. It just changed shape. It became quieter, like a dull hum beneath the rhythm of my days. I went through the motions, waking up, making coffee, tending to my plants, checking the mail, pretending that routine was enough to fill the spaces he had left behind. But grief, I've learned, doesn't live in dramatic moments. It lives in the ordinary ones. The empty chair at the breakfast table, the phone that doesn't ring, the simple act of cooking too much food out of old habit. Every corner of my home whispered reminders of him, as though the walls themselves remembered better days and refused to let me forget. One evening, I received a message from his wife. Her tone was polite, distant, like someone performing a duty. She wanted to invite me for dinner. "It would mean a lot to him if you came," she wrote. I stared at the message for a long time, unsure whether to feel honored or pitied. The invitation felt less like a bridge and more like a test. Still, I said yes. Some part of me still hoped there was a way back, a way to reclaim the closeness we once had, even if it meant stepping into a space where I no longer belonged. The night of the dinner, I stood before my mirror again, just as I had the night of the wedding. I wore something simple, a soft blue dress that made me feel calm, invisible, safe. My hands trembled as I fastened my earrings, small pearls that had once belonged to my mother. I looked at myself and thought about how strange it is that mothers spend their lives building others, piece by piece, until there's almost nothing left for themselves. And yet, we keep showing up, to the graduations, the weddings, the dinners, even when the seat offered is no longer at the center but somewhere near the edge. When I arrived at their house, the lights were warm and welcoming. I could hear laughter before I even knocked, and for a fleeting moment, I almost turned away. But then the door opened, and there he was, my son. Older, more confident, with the easy smile of someone who no longer carries the weight of needing his mother's approval. He hugged me, and though his arms wrapped around me, I felt the distance in the way he pulled back too quickly, as if afraid of holding on for too long. His wife greeted me next, her tones syrupy and polite, her eyes scanning me with the cautious warmth of someone protecting their territory. The dinner table was beautifully set, candles flickering between dishes that smelled of garlic and rosemary. I sat across from them, watching how seamlessly they moved together, passing plates, finishing each other's sentences, sharing inside jokes that made me feel like a guest in a home I once helped build. When he looked at her, I saw the tenderness I used to see in his eyes when he looked at me as a child. The realization hit me like a quiet blow. I had become the past tense of his affection. We spoke about small things, work, the weather, their upcoming trip to Italy. I nodded, smiled, asked questions, pretending it didn't sting when he said, "we," instead of "I." At one point, he mentioned something about how she had helped him find balance, how she'd taught him patience. I wanted to remind him that patience was the very thing I'd taught him during every long night of his childhood, sitting beside him as he struggled with homework, heartbreak, and his father's absence. But I stayed silent. Sometimes, silence is the only dignity left to a mother. When dinner was over, his wife offered dessert, a cake, perfectly frosted, the kind I used to make for his birthdays. She served it with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. As she handed me a plate, she said softly, "He told me you used to bake all the time. You must have been such a wonderful mom." The past tense pierced me again. Used to. Were. As if motherhood ends when a child decides you no longer fit the image of their present. I forced a smile, thanked her, and took a bite of the cake, though I could barely swallow. Later, as I stood in the doorway to leave, my son walked me to the car. The night air was crisp, the moon hanging low, heavy with unspoken words. He hugged me again, longer this time, maybe out of guilt, maybe out of love. I couldn't tell anymore. Before I got in the car, I said, "You looked happy tonight." He smiled genuinely and said, "I am. She makes me feel at home." I wanted to tell him that home wasn't supposed to be a person you find later in life. It was supposed to be the one who built you, who stayed when everything else fell apart. But I only nodded. Mothers learn the language of restraint long before their children ever realize it. The drive back felt endless. The radio played softly, but every song seemed to echo something I didn't want to remember. I pulled over once, just to breathe. I thought of all the years I'd spent pouring myself into him, shaping my identity around being his mom. And now, without that role fully intact, I didn't know who I was anymore. The realization was sharp, like glass pressed against skin, not enough to bleed, but enough to leave a mark. When I got home, I sat in the dark for a long time. I thought about how motherhood isn't something that ends. It just changes form. We give and give until the world forgets what we've given, but love doesn't vanish. It lingers in the quiet, in the shadows of what we used to be, in the smell of a home-cooked meal, or the soft hum of a lullaby that no one remembers singing. I wondered if he ever thought about me when he was alone. If somewhere, beneath his new life, a small part of him still carried my voice, my lessons, my love. The thought comforted me just enough to stop the tears before they fell. Weeks later, a small envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a photo, him and his wife, standing by the sea, smiling. On the back, he had written, "Thinking of you, love always." Just 3 words, but this time, they felt different. Maybe he didn't mean to hurt me. Maybe his speech at the wedding wasn't about replacing me, but about expanding his gratitude. And maybe, just maybe, I had been too wounded to see it. That's the thing about love. It's imperfect, and so are we. We break, we heal, we misunderstand, but we keep loving anyway. Because what else is there? I placed the photo on my nightstand, next to an old picture of him as a child. The 2 faces, one boy, one man, seemed to blur into one. I realized then that motherhood isn't about being seen. It's about being the unseen force that shapes someone's soul. It's about letting them go, again and again, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. If you've ever had to love from a distance, if you've ever watched someone you raised drift into a new life that no longer needs you, I see you. You are not alone. Your love still matters, even if it's invisible now. And before we move on, before I tell you what happened the day he finally called me again, take a moment. Subscribe, so this story reaches more hearts like yours. Because what comes next changes everything. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, months after that quiet dinner. The kind of day that passes without promise or warning. The sky was gray, a steady drizzle blurring the world outside my window. I was folding laundry when the phone rang, the sound slicing through the soft hum of rain like a voice calling from another time. When I saw his name on the screen, my heart stuttered, unsure whether to race forward or hold back. I hesitated before answering, afraid of what his voice might carry, guilt, obligation, or perhaps nothing at all. But when I finally pressed the phone to my ear, it wasn't any of those. It was warmth, familiar, hesitant, and so achingly human that my knees nearly gave out. "Mom," he said softly, his tone stripped of ceremony, of the distance that had lived between us for so long. Just that one word, Mom, and something inside me broke open. He told me he'd been thinking about me, that he'd listened to an old voicemail I'd left him years ago, one of those short, meaningless messages mothers always leave. "Call me when you can. I love you." He said it had caught him off guard, that it made him realize how much space he'd let grow between us. I stayed quiet, listening, afraid that if I spoke, the spell might break. He said he was sorry, for the toast, for the distance, for not seeing what I had done for him all those years. I could hear the sincerity trembling beneath his words, and as much as I wanted to forgive him instantly, part of me hesitated. Not out of cruelty, but out of the quiet exhaustion that comes from years of loving without being seen. Forgiveness isn't a single act. It's a slow unfolding, like morning light filtering through heavy curtains. He asked if he could come over. I didn't trust my voice enough to say yes, so I simply whispered, "Of course." After we hung up, I stood in the middle of my small living room, surrounded by the hum of memories that seemed to wake from sleep. I didn't rush to tidy or cook or prepare. I just stood there, breathing as the rain outside softened into mist. When the knock finally came, it felt almost unreal. He looked different when I opened the door, not in the way time changes a face, but in the way humility softens a person. He hugged me before I could even say a word, and this time he didn't let go quickly. His breath trembled against my shoulder, and for a moment, it felt like the world was right again. The son I had raised, the boy who used to curl beside me after bad dreams, was still there, buried beneath the years and pride and unspoken pain, but there nonetheless. We sat by the window, the rain tracing delicate lines down the glass. He told me about the wedding, about how nervous he had been, how he hadn't meant to hurt me. He said the toast had been spontaneous, that he'd looked at his wife's stepmother and thought of kindness, of stability, of gratitude, but not of replacement. "I didn't mean it like that," he said, his eyes wet. "But I know that doesn't change how it felt." His honesty disarmed me. I had spent so long rehearsing anger, grief, disappointment, but not this, not his humility. I realized then that sometimes we expect apologies to come wrapped in perfection, when in truth they arrive like this, trembling, uncertain, but real. I told him I understood. That love, like life, is messy, full of misunderstandings that grow into silence if we let them. We talked for hours, about his new life, about my loneliness, about everything we had both been too afraid to say. At one point, I confessed that the hardest part hadn't been his words, but the feeling of being erased. He took my hand across the table, his thumb tracing the lines of my skin the way he used to when he was small. "You're not erased, Mom," he said quietly. "You're the reason I exist. You're the reason I know how to love at all." The simplicity of that truth undid me. Tears came, uninvited and unstoppable, carrying years of silence with them. He cried too. There, in that small living room with the rain whispering outside, we rebuilt something fragile but real. Not the same as before, maybe nothing ever is, but something honest, something that could breathe again. Later, as I made us tea, he wandered through the house, touching the little things that had once filled his childhood: a photo frame, a worn blanket, a small wooden toy. I watched him from the kitchen, realizing how life circles back in quiet ways. We lose each other, we break apart, and yet somehow we find our way home. Not always to the same place, but to the same truth: that love, real love, doesn't end. It changes, it hides, it waits, but it doesn't end. Before he left that night, he hugged me again and said, "I'll call you tomorrow." And he did. Every day after that, even if only for a few minutes. Sometimes just to say hello, sometimes to tell me about his day. The distance didn't vanish overnight, but it began to shrink, like ice melting beneath slow, patient sun. I didn't need grand gestures anymore. No speeches, no public praise. Just that steady, quiet connection that felt like coming home. Months later, he and his wife invited me over again, this time for a small family dinner. When I arrived, she greeted me with a softer smile than before. There was no tension, no performance, just warmth. As we ate, she reached for my hand and said, "He talks about you all the time. You should know that." The words landed gently, like a long-awaited apology, even if it wasn't hers to give. I nodded, my throat tight with gratitude. After dinner, as I watched them laugh together, I didn't feel replaced anymore. I felt fulfilled. Maybe that's what motherhood truly is, not being the center forever, but becoming the soil where new lives can root and grow. My son had become the man I had prayed he'd be: kind, steady, capable of love. And even if someone else helped shape the last parts of him, it was my love that began the story. That, I finally realized, could never be erased. Later that night, back home, I stood by the window again, the stars faint but visible. The world was quiet, my heart even quieter. I thought of every mother out there, sitting in the stillness after giving everything she has, wondering if her love still matters. It does. Even when unseen, it holds the world together in ways no one will ever truly measure. So, if you're here, listening, and you've ever felt invisible in the story you helped build, know this: you are not forgotten. You are the pulse beneath someone's joy, the echo in their laughter, the quiet reason they keep standing tall. Your love endures, even when it's not named. And as this story closes, let me ask you, did you see yourself somewhere in these words? Have you ever loved so deeply that it hurt to let go? Tell me in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if this story touched something inside you, if it made you feel seen, if it reminded you of your own quiet strength, then like this video, subscribe, and share it with another woman who needs to hear that her love, too, still matters. Because our stories are not over. They're still being written, in every heart we've ever touched, and in every silence we've ever endured.